Okay, hello and welcome. This event in classic style was completely sold out. We've been turning people away, and actually, of course, we've got empty seats. Hi, do come in. Welcome to Central St Martin's. My name's Lucy Kimbell. I'm Director of the Innovation Insights Hub, which is actually a UAL thing, although I'm based physically here at Central St Martin's. So thank you very much for coming today to this conversation about design, research and social futures. In a moment I'm going to hand over to my colleague Guy Julia to do a brief intro, summarising some of our recent research, and then we will have a panel discussion with responses from Anne Light, Professor of Design and Creative Technology at the University of Sussex, Professor Adam Thorpe, Professor of Socially Responsive Design here at Central St Martin's at UAL, and Professor Paul Rodgers, who is Professor of Design at Imagination, Lancaster, and also the Design Leadership Fellow for the AHRC, having a discussion really about social design research, and design research in relation to social issues. So I will hand over to
Okay, thank you. I have to apologise in advance. I'm deeply in the Lancaster zone today. I don't know how many other people are at that stage of the year where get competitive about how many lenses you've taken in a day. But I hope you can see the slides here. I didn't realise we would have such a small screen. I was assuming that this being Central St Martin's, we'd have full Emacs projection facilities and surround sound. But I just want to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the genealogy of where we've got to, Lucy and I, with the project, which is then going to lead into our discussion. So effectively, behind this event is the launch of this fine report Lucy and I have authored called Co-Producing Social Futures Through Design Research. And in it we propose some what we think are kind of quite novel ways, at least novel to the academic space, ways of approaching social design and dealing with multiple stakeholders, both within and without higher education. So one of the backgrounds to this piece of work we've done was a piece we did published a couple of years ago, called Social Design Futures, which was a strategy report we did for the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the proposals we put forward, just looking back on them, what we wrote 2 years ago, it kind of just says do more, really, in a way. Do more design-based research which engages with non-HEI stakeholders. But then the AHRC came back to us and said, okay, do you want to put your money where your mouth is and actually try out some of the things we're beginning to propose. Just to give two academic research backgrounds, which were hovering behind what we're doing. Two projects which were, one very long project, Connected Communities, the HRC programme, which Anne Light here knows an awful lot about over 300 projects which ran through several years. And this report, Creating Living Knowledge, came out about the same time we were concluding our research. And now also, concurrently, an ESRC project called Knowledge That Matters, Realising the Potential Co-Production. We can perhaps talk about this later, but just to be provocative at this stage, personally I couldn't see a lot of co-production actually in those projects they ran. But anyway, I'm not going to paralyse you with the details of this project we ran through about 9 months. What we started out by doing was trying to build a constituency of academic discussion. Hence we did a set of videos, which you probably can't see, it's too small there. And then we did a sort of sandpit workshop for 2 days in Lancaster in April 2015, out of which then came 5 prototyping projects, very rapid projects run through the summer of 2015. And then out of that, Lucy and I began to reflect on, well, what did all this experimentation mean? What are the implications of this? And to some degree, I think some of our thinking was influenced by Lucy's experience working with the policy lab in the Cabinet Office. I don't know if you want to, perhaps we'll talk about that later. Some nice pictures from it. And we, I think in a nutshell, where we are sort of situating this notion of co-producing social futures and design research can be best seen in terms of three modes of research. And it's just such a simple way of thinking about it. I wish I thought about it 20 years ago, but there you go. We think of, Venn diagrams, intersecting circles, that currently a lot of social science research and historical research is about actuality, what is around us today. And then in research, some of the ambitions to have more impact in public life, some of this seeps into potentiality, what could be, what might be in the future or change. And in a sense, we are looking for a kind of sweet spot where there's this deep sense of actual current contexts meets prototyping, developing approaches to what could be or change. And at least the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who funded this project, we are making three recommendations. One is this thing we're promoting is this idea of a two-stage research process in which we generally tend to find in research across the social sciences and humanities and the arts that so much research kind of almost creates the even the conclusions, but often the questions and the context of the questions and those people who are involved in those questions before the project has begun. And we're saying that these things need to be more deeply embedded into the project themselves, that kind of inquiry into who are the publics, who are the stakeholders, what are the key questions, what are the possible outcomes. We also find a kind of structural problem in higher education in terms of the way in which universities are set up isn't necessarily always conducive to doing particularly rapid collaborations with higher education institutions. And the third thing we want to propose is that hybrid outcomes of research need greater recognition. In other words, that the output of a research process might not be just single things, it might be a whole constellation of different media, different outcomes, different locations for knowledge. Okay, if you didn't quite follow all of that, we've produced a rather nifty animation which explains that. I'm going to show you this now. It's a case of I think that the film is always better than the book. So I'm going to just... hopefully this will do the job for us. Yes, here we are. No, it's not, is it? Got the sound, but not the... No, we're stuck in the PowerPoint, so big pun. Just close the PowerPoint.
Is it streaming directly from YouTube?
Yeah, we'll start it again. Get the sound effect twice though, it's quite nice.
Yeah.
Soothing.
Thank you, Lucy. Okay, well, so thanks to Holly MacDonald who did all the animation work, and we originally asked for about 2 minutes 30-second animation. It turned out 5 minutes 30 seconds. There again, our report was meant to be 10 pages, and we ended up with 76. So you know the way it goes.
Okay.
I just wanted to stick up some bunch of questions which we might discuss. But I'll hand over to Lucy.
Okay, so we not to directly respond to this, but to sort of talk about your work and research generally in relation to these kinds of themes. So we'll start with Anne to talk for up to 10 minutes and
yes, it's certainly sort of riffing in 3 directions, I think, your work. Really appreciated the model of the 3 different modes of thinking about research, the addition of the extra one, which focuses on the co-creation. Sorry, I'm speaking really quietly because I've also got a sore throat. and maybe I need to project a bit more, sorry. And I'm particularly interested to talk about perhaps the future orientation that is implied in that. Also the notion of designing for potentiality, quite specifically, rather than just sort of considering potentiality as a zone. And then perhaps say a bit more about the 2-stage research. One line which I particularly wanted to pull out too, because it's an area that interests me, is the report says, as well as producing concepts for future products, services and systems, researchers are at once designing future users, organisations and contexts of use. And it's that idea that, you know, design is situated heavily in the now, and a lot of people don't necessarily think past the now in their design because they've been commissioned to produce something. And quote the design anthropologists Anusis and Harkness recently in a great anthology that's just come out. They say mainstream design is typically drawn into what one could call a close present, the present of a recent yesterday, limited now and almost tomorrow. But actually, designs are incredibly powerful in that we know that we're designing between that actuality and that potentiality, and that it's not cost-free. Whatever we do actually creates something. So we're not only designing in a situated way spatially, but we're also designing in a situated way temporally. So design is situated and design is dangerous in that capacity. Especially if we don't assume that people are going to be the same regardless of what environments they're put into. And I think that's very interesting in terms of social design in a couple of ways. Because one is that if you're actually involving people in design, then there are some really critical questions like if part of how things change actually changes people, how do people get to contribute to how they, whether that's the things or the people, are changed? So we're actually not only constructing these services, but we're constructing the kind of society we want to live in through those sorts of things. That we might be democratising technologically informed change or designally informed change because we're making those changes by occupying that middle ground. We're not just trying to keep things as they are to find out what they are, but we're intervening to become. And in doing that, we're opening Pandora's box. This isn't new, but it's something that bothers me. And some of my questions have been related to how do we not only get people involved in inclusive products and inclusive processes of design, but actually if we're changing the world through these designs, taking it out to a new stage of anticipation, at least a kind of moral concern for anticipation, should we say. So there are spaces in which researchers are not only considering future making but also considering the nature of impacting and how future making is embedded in designing. And for me that's very powerful, particularly in a time when we're struggling with things like resource use, how we cope with public services when there's diminishing support for them. I don't know whether there's diminishing funding because we don't have the money or whether we just don't have the will to put the money into those sorts of things. But when we talk about social design, we're talking about how we coexist and how we make those structures. So if design is fundamentally about changing cultures as well as making things, and because we're going to, in a sense, to respond to some of these changing pressures on budget, interesting political times, certainly in interesting environmental times, we not only need to be designing things, but we need to be designing things to be different. And one of the things we therefore also need to be doing is to continue to be differently different and work out how our social design impacts on that. So that's where I think this, coming back to the two orbs, shall we say, and the sort of middle ground is really interesting, because what we're actually having to do is work together and co-produce and co-design spaces where we're anticipating the world that we're making as well as the sorts of services we might need in that world. So I'd argue that social design should be inclusive, that it's not just a job for designers, that it should be deferred and that we shouldn't be over-designing it now because we don't actually know what some of those different situations might need to look like. I'm reminded perhaps of those terrible unknown unknowns that we heard about last decade, and we now have differently different, which is also not a very nice phrase, and that it should be reflexive and that we're all implicated in this and that we're making our own world in this kind of a way. And that two-stage research is absolutely sort of critical in this because we can't know this stuff by looking at what we have now. In fact, quite radically, I think one of the joys of, if we accept that the world isn't fixed, that actually in doing something like participatory design, we're actually not only staging encounters to learn about how we are, but we're actually staging encounters to become different and find out what we can be. And that is a really powerful place for us to be, and that it relies very much on these kinds of iteration. And that said, I think it's quite difficult to do because I'll just conclude perhaps with a few comments on my experience of being part of an AHRC programme where they actually did fund two-stage research. We were given 4 months to develop a question with communities so that the question evolved as part of a discussion between researchers and community partners, as they're deemed within the AHRC's programme. And then we were funded if we had done a good job in developing a research question that was coherent and could be done for about £100,000, bearing in mind that an awful lot of that just goes into university overheads. And then if it was presented and it was plausible, then there was funding made available to do it. And actually, it was very difficult for the universities to do it. It was very difficult for the funding council to support it. And actually, the communities found this stricture of having to have had their idea in the first 4 months and then deliver on it, when in fact, as I think we all know, it's a long and evolving process to work out what your questions are and how you might want to answer them. Actually proved that we can talk about this and we can want it and we can see some very good sort of theoretical and philosophical reasons for it, perhaps some of which I've outlined, but it's really quite difficult to do. So I might conclude on that and accept any more prodding questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pass over now to Adam to share some reflections, drawing perhaps on your work.
Okay. Well, I think I'll pick up where you left off then, in terms of what's difficult to do and what we've done before in terms of two-stage research or multi-stage research. And I'll start by thanking you for what I think is really clearly articulated and clearly theoretically located piece of research that actually helps us to describe our practice that we've been doing for 10, 15 years in a way that perhaps gives it more credibility and more visibility. So that, I think it's really useful in that respect. Perhaps we can talk more later on about how that practice works in terms of multi-stages and whether this sort of formalised two-stage process is the way to do it, or whether things like the bike theft project that we did that ran over 7 years between 2004 and 2011, drawing on seven different types of funding from different places, building communities as it went, those communities changing at the edges in a sort of open innovation model, which I think has a lot in common with the sort of approaches you're describing, but perhaps not quite as clearly cut. I'm going to try and respond very briefly to some of the questions that you kindly sort of pointed us at to try and frame some of our feedback. I'm working with a group of people at the moment from the University of the Arts London and Camden Council on a project that we call Public Collaboration Lab, which is looking at where there's synergy between local government operational objectives, what local government has to do each day with and for its citizens and residents, and what design education's doing for its stakeholders, so students, staff, research staff, tutors and so on. And we're trying to find where that synergy is to see if we can develop some capacity to learn things from each other on an ongoing basis. We've also been looking at those practices where other people have been doing it in the UK and elsewhere. And we understand the terminology around infrastructure and this idea that HEFCE and the like will fund capital infrastructure. They'll give you up to several, tens of millions of pounds to buy a big laser to enable you to identify some new opportunities for developing the competencies around how you use that laser. But there's less availability around social infrastructuring funds, which is about basically creating those relationships and creating those from the scale of individuals to the scale of organisations. And that's really what we've been exploring through practice in Public Collaboration Lab, and also what I think some of what's been advocated within the report here, this idea of social infrastructuring through practice. And what we've found looking across that is that infrastructure is used as a term, but it's not very often operationalised in a way that local government partners can really understand what we're talking about sometimes. They get it generally, but then it's like, okay, how do I do it? And what we're saying, we've noticed that there's sort of three types of infrastructure in PRAPS that conclude in a fourth, we hope, if we can get there. The first of which is this idea of relational infrastructuring, what we're calling relational infrastructuring, which is about individual one-to-one relationships. Typically, this sort of infrastructuring and these relationships are based around finding some sort of mutual value and mutual understanding, hopefully building towards this sort of quite personal levels of trust. The benefits of that sort of relational infrastructuring is that when emergent opportunities appear, you're actually in a position to be able to move towards them because you trust and understand and have perhaps shared values, not necessarily shared objectives, but shared values with the people that you're going to go on the journey with. So that's the relational bit. Another type of infrastructure we've noted, and there are ways that you can develop that. These sorts of soirees and discussions are ways that you can develop relational infrastructuring. People having conversations person to person, finding out what each other think, thinking who they'd like to know more about and whose ideas they'd like to explore further. So there's some methods that go with developing these sorts of infrastructures. Then we've got what we're calling thematic infrastructuring, which is something you see quite a lot of, which is that sort of get together around a theme, who are all the stakeholders around ageing, let's get them all together in a room, we can link them all up and then we can get cracking and really do something about this. Very objective orientated, very sort of dynamic in terms of delivery. But what you'll notice when you start digging around in these things is if you don't have the relationships, then actually just because you've got a common operational objective doesn't mean that you're going to be able to have that trust, that shared value, that confidence to move forward, and a confidence to be able to openly negotiate, to be able to say, I don't know what I'm doing here fully, but I do have some competencies about how we might find out. It takes quite a lot of trust in a relationship to be able to turn around to somebody and say that. But unless you can say that, you can't really be doing this, you can't really do this really sort of exploratory experimental work, in my opinion. You want to be able to get to a place with the people you're going to work with that you don't know that well, where you can actually say to them, well, we're not quite sure what we're doing here, but how do you think we should do it? How should we get here? Rather than the sort of consultancy approach of selling certainty. And we would argue that design's all about this idea that we can embrace uncertainty and all the rest of it. Well, that's great. How about other people embracing uncertainty? And what is it that gives you the confidence to do so? So that's the sort of the strengths and weaknesses of operational. Strengths is that it's objective orientated. People like a good objective and it can be useful. Weaknesses are that, Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get there. Don't expect it to come out right. Then we've got what we call strategic infrastructuring, which Camden and UAL have had a relationship for years and years on paper. And sometimes things have happened around funding and around quite high-level strategic sort of objectives. But actually, unless you've got the relationships between people and the operational context in which to implement it, then your strategic infrastructuring aims and vision statements don't count for anything. So what we're really saying is not that one of these approaches is better than another, because they've all got different strengths and weaknesses. But if we can, but actually they're sort of interdependent in terms of trying to deliver change. And what we're talking about is what we're calling systemic infrastructuring, which perhaps is when you get all three of these things in place, where you've got the relationships, you've got the operational understandings of where we're trying to get to together, and we've actually got the strategic buy-in that means that we might be resourced or certainly won't be blocked when we try and get there. So these are some of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about in relation to infrastructuring. How might current political and economic uncertainties shape it? I'll go quite quickly here actually, and I'll draw on your models. So I'm going to quickly grab a pen and try and explain where our situation is in terms of... So I've just tried to describe to you where we're located with our project. And I think with this, I think that it has a relationship to these models that Lucy and Guy have usefully introduced for us. So where we've been talking with the project we've been doing with Camden Council for the last couple of years, and in fact the year before when we were trying to work out whether we could do something together, the justification is that basically we might be going on this journey from making sense of what is, so sense making, to implementing what will be, which you could argue is if you're implementing it in response to a particular challenge, you could argue that's problem solving, but I understand that people have issues around problem solving because the problems go round and round. But implementing what will be. Now on that journey, the reason we've been working with Camden and the arguments we've been having is that actually we said, well look, design education spends a lot of time here. We only really get about halfway along this line, and only do we ever really need to, because it's not our job to be going around implementing what will be, but it is our job, and we do concern ourselves a lot in using these designing approaches to trying to make sense of what is on the journey to what might be. Meanwhile, local government are here, busy, responsible for implementing what will be. Everyone's on their case to implement what will be yesterday. They've got very little resource and reducing resource to be able to do that. And at the same as having reducing resource to be able to do that, they know full well that with that reducing resource, they haven't got so much time to spend doing the research, the public forming and understanding what is now. So what we've been saying is, listen, perhaps there's a synergy there between what we're doing within design education, and when I say education, I mean learning and teaching, so research and teaching, it's all learning for us, and what local government's doing here. So that's where we started. Looking at these models, it seems to me that perhaps this bit here is a bit mode one. And I'd be interested, it's only a straw thing, but this bit here is a bit mode one, looking at what is, doing the typical sort of ethnographic design and research of what is. You could then argue perhaps that this bit, as we start to move into some prototyping ideas, trying some stuff out, making some propositions in a typical design project that any one of you designers might have engaged with, you move from this discover through to some ideas, blueprints, service blueprints, prototypes will be the end of your project really, because we don't really go that much further in terms of implementation. And that really is starting to talk about that sort of mode two perhaps, how things could be. And then maybe this middle bit here, where actually you really do get to pick up and spend some real time. So we've got officers from the council working with teams of postgraduate students with researchers embedded there as well to try to start this journey of, okay, what can we do about some of these challenges? And when that happens, we're in this sort of mode three, how things could be. But then there's this other bit here, which perhaps is where local government is. So I guess what I'm saying is, when this idea of the future in the present, because it goes round, doesn't it? So we start off here with what is, and then eventually, actually, when these guys start implementing, we're back to what is again. And within that space, you see, from a design lead perspective, we can be talking very much about how much dynamic we are in change and how we're driving this change. But you could argue actually that politics and politicians are driving, rapid transformational change, much faster than social social designers are. And so perhaps there's this bit in the co-production of research where we need to think about mode 4 research and think about, okay, well, what's going on there, given that here we are thinking we're dealing with the future possibilities. So maybe it's about this sort of how things are, how things could be, how things are, but coming from different ends of the spectrum of it. I don't know, but I thought there was certainly a relationship between the models and the local government design education bit.
Thank you very much. Paul, so I already introduced you. Apologies for the mix-up over the start-up time. So hopefully what we did was just do a brief intro, guided, and then we showed the little animation. But we're not, as you can see, we're not just asking for responses to that.
So you want me to kind of respond to these 3 questions?
Yeah, I'll talk broadly. Talk more broadly because you're working in this area as well. So,
okay.
so today generally we're going to look at these questions.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So what? Yeah. Well, I managed to kind of look at the questions and the animation, which was great. Yeah, it's really kind of good to be here having a chat. I guess. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll just respond to maybe the first question. I guess. And really, I would say that it's a great time to be a design researcher. I mean, arguably there's never been a better time. And I think there's loads of opportunities to do great things. And I had a colleague who's from Australia, and what he says to his students, and I think it's a kind of wonderful provocation, is that he says to them, have a look out the window. What do you see? And if you're at Lancaster, you see lots of trees, if you can see beyond the fog and the greyness. And the provocation really is to say, well, is it perfect, what you see? And of course the answer has to be no. And his response then is to say, well, go out into the world and make an intervention, change something as a designer. And I think that's great. I think there's loads of opportunities for us as design researchers to make positive social change. About 6 years ago, we formed a little group called the Design Disruption Group at Northumbria. And we formed it because we were disillusioned really with design research, design practice, and design education and how it was being conducted. Northumbria is quite a successful in some ways. Design school that produces people like Jonathan Ive and Tim Brown, and there's wonderful students that are incredibly bright young design students, designers, but it's very commercially oriented. And I remember sitting in a room just like this, well, it's bigger than this room. In fact, I think it was 3 or 4 times the size, and it probably had 3 or 4 times as many people, students and staff. And there was 2 people from Nike, and they were setting a brief for all the design students, and they wanted every design student in the room to design a new training shoe, cross-platform shoe for either the Rio Olympics or the Tokyo Olympics. And I counted the students and the staff that were in the room, and we were in the room for about an hour, and Nike had sponsored this project to the tune of 20 or 30 grand. And later that night, the great and the good of Northumbria University went for dinner and probably blew 10 grand on the dinner, which was in a really posh part of Newcastle. So we kind of thought that was massively, well, that can be massively immoral, unethical, hugely unethical.
Hugely unethical.
Yeah, hugely unethical. It certainly was. Because anything that the design students produced would go straight to Nike, and that's kind of corrupt, I think. So we were disillusioned, and we decided to work with others, and in particular we decided to work with the third sector. So we didn't want to do any commercial projects anymore. So we worked with a lot of third sector organisations in the northeast, and we just really wanted to help them. We didn't really have any agenda. We didn't want to set up any kind of non-disclosure agreements or any other form of collaborations, certainly formal collaborations. But really just to say to them that we'd be really privileged to work with them, and that the relationship could end at any time, but they would decide when it ended. So some of those relationships are still ongoing. Some of them have kind of stopped, but they might crop up again, and some have been problematic, which is kind of interesting, I think. So, yeah, I mean, what kind of infrastructure and capacities are required to do design research that results in social change? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that any are, because I think we as design researchers should just get on with it, really. And I think many of our interventions were really small, really insignificant. But I think that reflecting on my life, I mean, I live a kind of rather complicated life in that I work in Lancaster but live in Glasgow. So my family and my personal life is in one city, and other lives are in other places. And tiny, tiny things can have massive influences on my life. So the fact that my son might get out of school 15 minutes before he usually gets out of school can blow everything completely. It can blow a week of organisation completely and utterly out of the window. And some of those meetings that I should be attending might be important. So tiny little changes like shifting something 5 or 10, 15 minutes can have massive consequences, huge consequences. And I think we took that to the organisations that we wanted to work with. I think it's kind of important, I mean, in saying that it's never been a better time to be a design researcher and that there's loads and tons of opportunities out there, I think it's really important to focus and decide on the problems and questions and issues that we should work on, and that should be done collaboratively, if not set by, certainly in our case, they tended to be set by the third sector, the collaborating organisation, which is kind of great, really, and it's fairly kind of conventional anyway for designers to be set things by other people. It's not unsurprising. So, for example, I mean, one of the projects that's been ongoing for quite a few years now is we're working with carers in the northeast. So Newcastle is a very deprived area in many respects, and there are a lot of people, a lot of informal carers that save the British government something like, £2 or £3 billion a year, if not more. And really, we've worked with a group called Newcastle Carers, a third sector organisation, for a few years now, and we now have a PhD student working with them. And really what we were trying to do is to understand better the journeys of care that informal carers and those being cared for go through. And some of those insights that we've found have been kind of eye-watering, to say the least. And what we're trying to do is make those carers' lives and experiences a tiny bit better. So we've been working at local level with a local third sector organisation called Newcastle Carers, who are then a member of the Carers organisation, which is a kind of national organisation. But the work that Dan has been carrying out, the PhD student, that work quickly receives recognition and is then kind of disseminated mainly by kind of word of mouth. So from a tiny little local intervention in Newcastle, Dan has been invited to all over the region, to the northeast and further afield now, spreading over to the west, the northwest of England, and also to a kind of national level now, where the Alzheimer's Society and Alzheimer's UK are now getting involved. And really what Dan's hoping to do is come up with some designed intervention that I guess pinpoints and signposts a little bit better to those that are caring for someone where they might find services and help. And he's doing that in a kind of wonderful designerly way. So do you want me to keep going? Or is that enough?
Oh, that's probably, just...
Yeah, I mean, I kind of try to...
Barriers?
I think the questions are great, they're really tough. I don't know what the answers are. Yeah, the barriers one. Is that number 3?
It is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will always be barriers, so we just should get on with it. And I think the current political and economic situation, whatever that might be, because I've just been through 2 referenda. Is that plural of referenda? Referendum? Soon probably have a third. maybe a fourth. Yeah. not
With
sure.
any luck.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so
Here
sure.
in Scotland, it's
Um,
different, isn't it?
So, I mean, yeah, there'll always be barriers, and quite frankly, I can only see things getting a little bit worse in the near future. I think the current UK Westminster government, their agenda is clearly in STEM, which is kind of upsetting, a little bit disappointing, given how important design, the creative industries as a whole are to the UK. And the fact that in many regards we kind of lead, we're a global leader in that. So, but we could bang that drum forever and ever and not get anywhere. So I think we just really need to get on with it. And I think, design researchers are the best form of researchers that should be leading some of these challenges. And I think, people like me and people like you and you, if we keep kind of banging that drum, then eventually someone will listen to us. And I think we do have the ear now of some people, and I think that will change. But I think we need to continue to ask the right questions. We need to continue to address the important issues within societies. And we need to bring teams of great people together. So we won't do it on our own. So it's about, as Adam said, it's about building those relationships. It's also about trying to find people that will act as an advocate or a champion for some of those causes. So in the carers example I gave you in the North East, we have an amazing chief executive who's wholeheartedly on board everything that we are trying to do. And she, continually bangs the drum at any meeting she attends on our behalf. So those teams of great people that we bring together should be design-led, and I think together we can make transformative contributions that will have real impact in the world.
Okay, thank you. So, unless anyone wants to say anything in response, we should just open. Do you want to just go to the floor? So we have a microphone, and I should have said we're actually audio recording this. This is so that the many people who couldn't be here tonight and emailed us can actually have access to this discussion. So please be aware of that. So I'm going to pass around this mic. If anyone has any questions for any of the individuals who've just spoken, or who just want to share us a perspective from their own research. So if you could introduce yourself.
Anna Williams from Goldsmiths. It's more of a comment than a question. I think the diagram that you drew on the flip chart, it's a problem that I've seen not only between organisations, so you're saying that's two organisations working together and encountering this problem, but also within organisations. So I've worked from Nesta, and they've got a problem with sharing. So there's a section of people that do the doing, I call it, and there's a section of people that do the research, and that's not even connected internally at the moment. So it's not just a challenge between organisations, but within. So, yeah.
My name is Jesse. I'm a student of Innovation Management, St. St. Martin, and my question is, in all of these disciplines, we get told about the frameworks we need, technical frameworks we need to work with, which is what you guys have done. But the research I've been, doing of late has got to do with liminality and liminal spaces. And you have said that the future is unknowable. We just have to crack on with it. We just have to learn by experience. And there, from what you also shared, what is coming to me from in that light of what I've been working on is the fact that while the design community is here trying to provide frameworks, you get problems with other stakeholders, probably because they don't have the frameworks, but because I think there is some sort of mental framework of the people, the type of people that actually make up the teams. So I just want to know what you think about that, if it's something that you've encountered in your, business or whatever you're doing.
I'd say, Adam, do you want to answer that? Because you're working with people who are extremely sort of lacking in resource, local organisations as Paul does, but also local government, which is under particular stresses because of the current government
Yeah, I mean, within that sort of trying to look across the different types of infrastructuring, I agree. You know, we've been getting on with it for 15 years and delivering impacts, but perhaps that more people would have been getting on with it and delivering similar impacts if they were more visible and if they were more easily funded, which I guess is where some of this sort of research reporting can facilitate that, making recommendations and so on. But in terms of are people important, yeah, I'd say the infrastructuring approaches, the relationships are the most important part of it. But when you're working with local government, one of the challenges is churn, because, you know, within the last, I'll give you an example. We did a project, so it was BA students on that occasion, BA product design students, did a project around waste separation. It's £50 a tonne more to burn or bury waste than it is to recycle or reuse it. They've got to get 1.6 million out of the waste management budget. So can we get people to separate their waste and save some money? What can product design do in that? For us, product design, we recognise individual outputs, a bit tricky because it doesn't really fit. But actually, I think it works here in that whilst the students are going for the product, which is the destination that enables them to go, that motivates them to go on the journey, it's the journey, the process is the thing that actually involves all the different actors and stakeholders brings that and can drive behaviour change, can shine awareness on an issue, and so on. So, yes, people are the most important part of it. They change a lot, which is a real problem, because when we started that project, we were working with the Department of Culture and Environment, and by the time we finished that project, we were working with the Directorate of Communities. So it changed at the directorate level. At the beginning, we were working with somebody that was in a waste management role, that then got transferred, and by the end, we were working with somebody that was in a housing role. So not only the people that you're dealing with changing, but the whole configuration of government's changing because they're constantly taking money out of the system, and the whole configuration is changing. So relationships are incredibly important. It's very difficult to keep those relationships if the institution basically sheds people. I think the most important thing though is around, for me, it's about redundancy. I don't know if I might get an opportunity to say this at another occasion, so I'll say it quickly now, because to me, I think it's at the crux of the whole thing, and I didn't get to saying it there. And for me, I think that, I know redundancy is a terrible word to use in local government at the moment or anywhere else, but at the same time, redundancy, what I mean here is, we need to have redundancy, we need to have more than we need. You know, without redundancy, you can't have innovation. Without redundancy, you can't have experimentation. Without redundancy, you don't have time for reflection. Without reflection, you can't learn. So at the time, so efficiency, in my opinion, which is what we're being told we've got to drive for in local government, is the enemy of innovation. Because efficiency denies redundancy, and redundancy is essential to reflection and learning and innovation. So what we're hoping here is that actually what we should be able to bring into that situation is some redundancy. We should be able to create some diversity, some more choices, some more people. That as local government people are falling off, we are very, very sensitised to the fact that we should not be getting students to do graduates' jobs. We will never take on a job that is not about where you don't have the opportunity to fail, where you don't have the opportunity not to fulfil a brief. So if someone comes and they know what they want, then that's not what we're doing. You know, if you come and you say, right, this is the challenge area, then we'll go and explore that with the people. What we're trying to get to is how do you involve more of the communities in a meaningful way in those projects, rather than dipping in and out. How do you maintain those relationships? And a lot of it's to do with place-based activities, I think. And I think that the university is a community anchor that's going to be, hopefully, I mean, we're all under pressure. We're going to be around for a while. As a community anchor, it's got the opportunity to try and provide some of that redundancy, trying to provide some of that permanence of people in place, to try and maintain some of those relationships. Sorry, it was a long answer.
Joss, and then Graham.
Are we going to be commenting on that?
Oh,
I don't know.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead if you have. Sorry.
Because I was also struck by something in your question, which was about different ways of thinking and encountering. I don't know. Was that in there?
Yeah.
But you know, when you bring different disciplines together with different priorities and how that plays. So I wasn't going to elaborate on it, but I think that's implicit in a lot of what you're saying, but I think there's also something quite particular about how it is to work with people who see a problem or come at it from a completely different perspective, and how to negotiate those boundaries is a huge part of what good design research entails in the practicing of it, as well as the it's not so much the theorising of it maybe, but even what one understands to be the issue can be entirely different depending on which frame you bring on how you would, and how much you're a detail person or tolerant of ambiguity is also very much often to do with how you've been schooled. So just to acknowledge that.
And I think we need more practice in creating and working within those kind of agonistic spaces where we don't know and where there are competing voices. Sometimes, practice from a kind of personal level of how we kind of process this sort of as people, but also practice in terms of thinking, well, are there different models of dealing with that, with those kind of agonistic, and setting up those agonistic spaces?
Supports Adam's point about the value of redundancy, because if you know what the solution is, efficiency always supposes that you know what your answer is. And I don't know if any of you have seen the book, what's it called, Homo Deus, but it's just impressed me with the idea that something that I've been thinking about, but beautifully encapsulating, talking about the narrowness between what the environment's driving at the moment and the sort of technological solutions that are supposed to be fixing it, and how actually the two are creating a thinner and thinner wedge of opportunity to actually be doing something. And out of that is that sort of a sense that we don't know what the answers are. You cannot be efficient towards it. It's like the sort of idea that you can somehow move a majority of people towards a solution that only works if you're really sure that when you get there the problem is solved. And so, more generally, one of the importances of the creative thinking that we're probably all, and the innovation that you're speaking of, is that actually we need to be divergent thinkers. We need all those different priorities in the room to even begin to answer some of the challenges we're looking at. And it's a shame that we're hearing more and more orthodox political positions at a point when that's just not solving anything. But I think everyone in the room knows that.
Do you want to add anything, Paul?
Yeah, the word redundant, there's some of those words I struggle with, like innovation, efficiency and redundancy. I used to work in a shipyard on the River Clyde, so the redundancy word was a word that was used many times, usually as a threat. So I've kind of been there. And it's interesting because I've always kind of put the university or the academy alongside that word, redundant, because I think for huge periods of the year, the week or the day or the month, the academy is entirely redundant. And what we tried to do at Northumbria was see it was a terrible metaphor, and I've yet to come up with a better one in 6 years, so I need to apologise, but we kind of saw it as a revolving door or as a mirror where we wanted people that would never set foot in the academy to come in, and also people in the academy like professors and other people, great and the good, to kind of take them out and work. So there was like a kind of two-way street, and I think that worked quite well. So I think there's an element of redundancy in the academy, frankly, and I'd like to see universities become what the late Stuart MacDonald spoke about as kind of hybrid or mongrel institutions. And I think there's possibly some movements towards that with the way that funding councils are looking at the notion of kind of independent research organisations, and I think there may well be further movement on that where it won't just be places like this that will be able to hold grants and put on exhibitions and do other things, but there'll be other organisations, so there'll be a much more of a kind of mongrel and hybridisation and cross kind of pollination of universities, museums, perhaps companies, third sectors, which may make some parts of what we do at the moment redundant.
Yeah, we've got design students going out and working in the council building for 3 months at a time, alongside the officers. So the officers are teaching them, they're teaching the officers, everyone's teaching each other. The community people are saying, hang on, that's not how it goes like this. So, yeah, I agree with you. I thought you were going to talk about the fact that a lot of the resources of the university are redundant when the doors close, and the fact that we've got sort of 8 before CNC machines that could be producing bespoke furniture for overcrowded living or something like that as well, as the fact that the staff might not be out and about. But permeability of the institution is something that we talk a lot about and that we're trying to move towards, and yet at the same time you get, passes the passes. You have to
Alcatraz in reverse.
Passes
Yeah.
Alcatraz in reverse, exactly. Pass up and out. Tricky one.
My name's Jocelyn. I'm a design consultant. I work for a design agency called Us Creates that does lots of stuff around health and wellbeing. And I'm also doing a PhD looking at how design's being used by policymakers. So I've got a kind of sort of I've got 2 heads. I just want, so actually, right, I've got 4 very brief points, although they're slightly interlinking. So I completely agree with what Adam, what you were just saying about efficiency not leading to reflection, exploration, and I think that is a distinction between design consultancy and design research, in that you very rarely in consultancy have the space to I suppose reflect in the same way that you do when you're doing research, and and that's partly to do with having an efficiency-oriented and goal-oriented mindset on projects. So I think that's part of the space for design research, in distinction to kind of other kinds of design practice. And I kind of have this sense from, I suppose, having looked a little bit at what's going on in government and in the design sector and design research over the last few years, that there is this slight shift where there's kind of an opportunity space for design research and researchers in general to sort of pick up the slack where government's not really doing stuff really anymore, which is problematic but also interesting. So I think there is definitely, there's growing scope for interesting work. But I think I don't know whether this is going to make me very unpopular by saying this, but I think one of the reasons that design research is not always pervasive and visible within the research ecosystem is a lot of it is just really badly written. And I don't know there's a thing about is it just that it's a different kind of research, and does that need to be acknowledged, which I guess is what Lucy and Guy have been exploring in their work. But I also think that sometimes, so as a design consultant, sometimes I look at design research and just think, well, that's just a bit of, someone's just done a project and written down what they've done, which to me doesn't constitute research, and it's not necessarily that interesting. So I think that's an issue, and there's at least 3 of us in the room who are currently being funded by AHRC to do design PhDs, specifically, I think, to address that issue of just the general kind of quality not always being great. Obviously, present company excluded. And then just the last thing, so I had a conversation with Public Health England recently about how do we and it was their tobacco and alcohol team, so how do we stop people from smoking and drinking, basically. That's the problem they're constantly grappling with and have been grappling with for a very long time. And one of their sort of reflections was that quite often we have these innovation consultants and designers and people that come in and they do projects and they kind of tell us quite often the same solutions to challenges, but things don't get implemented. And why is that? So I think there is something about, if you dwell too long at the kind of left-hand end of your diagram, you don't really understand you can't understand what it is that it takes to sort of translate from the kind of, what could be to what is that, what gets put in place. And so I think there is something to be said for almost doing design research at the implementation, at the kind of doing your ethnography in the institution, in the mechanisms of government, why doesn't stuff happen, is an interesting site for research.
Is that kind of Adam's mode 4 research, really? Is it?
It could, yeah. I think that's it's definitely the fact that there's something else going on there that we sort of haven't got to in the modes 1, 2, and 3, but is equally impactful. So I think you've articulated it clearer than I was grappling at something. Yeah.
Anybody want to expand on Joss's comments?
I do. I think putting your third and your fourth point together there is that one of the big reasons that lots of this stuff doesn't get implemented is because there's a very thin understanding of the kind of macro context and structures within which the design exists or might exist. So a very thin understanding, for example, of the power structures of local authorities, the decision-making processes, the languages which are used, and so on. Interestingly, I was speaking with a friend of mine in Spain last week who has kind of given up design and is training to be a social worker now because, well, not entirely given up design. What she's doing, she's training to be a social worker entirely to learn the language of the welfare sector, so that she can be more precise and have more impact as a designer in that. It's interesting. Perhaps we should all do that.
Yeah, no, I said that version of that to a class of service design master's students at Carnegie Mellon a few months ago. What are you doing when you're graduating? Don't join a service design consultancy. Just get a job as a manager. Don't have designer in your job title. Just do it in that context. And they all look really shocked, probably because they're all going to go and earn big bucks implementing design thinking in IBM instead. Okay, so
yeah,
yes.
I mean, I think just quickly on that. I mean, I think it's what Adam said. I mean, the turnover in local government and some of these organisations is rapid. So often you find yourself working on things, and then by the time you kind of get to implementation, you're kind of dealing with completely different people. But I think if you can have someone that a kind of ally in the organisation, to kind of champion what you're doing, and that can help a lot. So some of the projects we've done in Newcastle a while back. I mean, we worked with the at a kind of chief executive level. So the chief executive of Newcastle YMCA was able to kind of, I guess, lean a little bit on the staff there, or at least kind of convince them that the things that we were proposing were worth doing. So I think that always helps. That going in at a kind of certain level in the organisation can help. But it's always about relationship building, I think, convincing people, and really kind of developing compelling things, things that are going to convince and compel, and that people will have confidence in.
One of the things we're trying to do around that with the in the local government context we're working in here is the idea that people learn through their experience. So in the same way that we learn through our experience, if we can create this capacity then, rather than redundancy, so that I'm compelled to try and, in a way, reclaim some of these words that have been taken from us. In the same way, there are a number of words that actually can be useful to us to be able to describe it, but they've been forced in a certain direction. We've got two arms, lots of 10 fingers, 6 fingers. So it's just like, we've got. All I'm saying is that redundancy is a natural trait for resilience, isn't it? And we need that within our organisations. But what we've got is that in January we've been reflecting with our team and the local government officers we're working with to try and articulate what we've been calling an anatomy of design education and local government collaboration, where we're going very specifically into the operational perspectives around who, what who in terms of which actors involved and in which stages of the process and what agency have they got. So, and we're able to do, that's where design process is really useful. Because even if we take the basics of divergent and convergent stages in the process, when you can actually map actors against that, you can realise that actually lots of people get to join in the divergent stages, but there are far fewer voices heard in the convergent stages, for example. So these are some of the areas where design can make a contribution, not really in terms necessarily as in the design-y ways we think of, but weirdly it seems that their design sort of flips between this idea, between great ambiguity on the one hand, but then this real specificity on the other, in terms of when you put a process on something, you go, right, this is the methodology. It sort of it makes it very explicit who's doing what, where, and that's been quite useful. And within in terms of where you get your champions, again, it's about being relationships sort of throughout the layers. So we've noticed there's these sort of 3 layers that are operating within local government. One that's like this vision and decision layer, which is often around your members and your central management team. And then you've got this more operational layer, which is around the civil servants that are sort of doing the work and trying to configure inform the proposals that the central management team and cabinet might make decisions on. And then you've got this more implementational layer, which is actually about implementing those proposals and trying to get across those, like one of our colleagues at the back said, trying to get across those 3 layers within an organisation and join that bit up is really tricky. But the projects that we do happen in these interstitial spaces, they happen between those layers. And that actually helps to join some of these things up. And because it's not costing anyone anything, because it's a learning opportunity for everybody, it grants you that opportunity to try to get some connections going and get some exchanges made between the levels.
I'm really interested in the idea of the swapping and the multiple cross-disciplinary. If you go back 40 years to commercial radio, there was a prototype, the first person who rang in and said, I need a particular drinking vessel, I've got a cleft palate, and another part of London responded and said, I've got a spare one. I think the particular problem at the moment, especially for arts universities, is this excitement about spectacle and immersive, and because we're a screen-led culture. And I'm really interested in the fact that the other side of that is that a lot of our students have got no confidence and have some problems. And I'm really interested then if we do the two-stage process a bit more. It seems to me that in a university, it's what'll it cost? We haven't got the budget for that. So personal adrenaline goes into finding collaborators. And I'm wondering whether we have to embrace the commercial brands and absolutely sell them this prototype, which you're calling hybrid, because I think you've got to put the intervention in as a radical stance now. And commercial radio did it with Help a London Child, or the particular swap shop, or Find a Flat, come into our foyer. And I think there's a power in universities, and if we don't use it, or academies, the likes of the next generation of the Trump reality show star will take over from where we are.
Another question about implementation, actually doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just universities or academies or colleges or places of learning. I mean, I've fairly recently finished a one-year fellowship with Alzheimer's Scotland. So I worked with 131 people with dementia. And what they did, I think I might have some information on it that I can pass around, but what I got them to do was to, I mean, one of the aims of the project really was to challenge, kind of preconceived ideas about somebody living with dementia. So I set I thought I was setting a 6-week project, so a kind of project to break the ice with me and care workers and family members and people with dementia. And the project took 16 months, so from 6 weeks to 16 months. Just a slight underestimation of what was involved. But what eventually came out at the end of that is a mass-produced product, and it's a simple product. It's a tartan. So there's a woman called Nan who lives in Inverness, and she has dementia, and she's designed a tartan, so the new tartan for the organisation, which is now on the market and potentially sells all over the world. And I think recent estimations of the value of design to the UK economy is something like £6-7 million a day. So in a very tiny way, Nan, who's got dementia, lives in Inverness, has contributed to that income, UK income, through design. So I think, it's not only academies and places of learning, but it's places like dementia resource centres where there's, in my opinion, huge untapped capacity to do a lot more. And some of these, 131 people with dementia, you're a consultant eye surgeon one day, and the next day you've got a diagnosis of dementia, you're somebody with dementia. And many of these people were architects, electronic engineers, surgeons, professional football players. There was a model. I mean, the kind of normal people just like you and I. And upon receiving that diagnosis of dementia, there's still a lot more that they can contribute to UK society. So I think we need to challenge a little bit more about who can, be within that kind of creative kind of amalgam of stuff that goes on.
Martin?
Okay. It provokes an awful lot of, my brain is kind of buzzing with all sorts of things. But my name is Martin, I'm a creative practitioner and consultant. I've done a lot of work in qualitative research, but also working with leadership and culture change. And one of the projects at the moment is with Peterborough Council around how to get them to function from the bottom up. How do we provide the services that people want rather than think that these are the services they want? So a couple of things, I guess, on a sort of a higher, not higher level, but more innocent level, is within qualitative research, you often got engaged in vanity projects where you knew damn well that you were doing the research and that all they wanted to know was the answer, but they weren't actually going to action on it. They just wanted to confirm things that they'd already knew, or they had budgets that needed to do that. So I guess the question, how do you avoid the vanity project, or where action is never even intended to be made, really? Also, about process, I sort of come back a little bit to what the gentleman was saying there, is that processes are fine, but unless the people are different or have changed in some way or are guided in some way to respond differently, it just becomes another process that they just engage in a bunch of steps, and they're not really, they're not different in themselves. So it's a question, I guess, about that. And then I suppose the last one was about social change, where in this political landscape now, not that it's that clear what it is, but I have a sense that in the room, or with us, most of us here, I'm being slightly presumptuous, that we're certainly left of centre with our views about what we mean by social change. So if we're truly about collaboration and co-creation with the public, and the leanings are going differently than our own personal kind of leanings, how do we work with that to give a genuine result, I guess?
Hello, my name is Caitlin Tothva. I'm a PhD student at London College Fashion. And yeah, a bit drawing on that comment. Also, when you are working with, say, an industry partner, and therefore one of your goals is to challenge them and to challenge the ways that they're doing things, in my experience, that can be really difficult, because it's usually then an add-on where you're trying to add that to everything else you were supposed to achieve. And I don't think, any advice about how you go about doing that as well is just, convincing them that this thing that they haven't actually asked for in the brief is also just as important.
So we've got different kinds of question bundled in, but about, again, the political context and how our individual values and commitments might differ from those we're working with, challenges of working with partners, the cynicism of some commissioned research.
Well, I wanted to comment on the vanity project, because I think that those can be a Trojan horse. Yeah. What you do, and I think maybe comes back to Caitlin's point too, which is that in a way you're establishing your credentials, and the fact that what they think the problem is never really the problem. It's always up, and sometimes it's actually about their relationship with the rest of the people around them and how they affect change. So usually in those sorts of situations, usually it's a huge word, but there's something that can be redeemed, in the sense that you might be able to go in and make connections that would mean that when they actually try and achieve something, there's a pathway that didn't exist before. And also more credibility for design. I mean, coming back in the sense to your thing, was, how many people think that design is really about making something sort of pretty or work, or, they don't understand that it's a process. So any opportunity to be in there and actually able to demonstrate a way of working immediately starts to change culture, and especially when you make a space which is a no-blame space. I mean, I'm not actively working with a local council at the moment, but my God, it's all the times that I have done, especially as things have got harder over the last few years, that feeling that if you put a foot wrong or waste a pound, that there's a whole weight to come down on you, and that there are members who are going to ask you why you did it, and the Daily Mail is going to ridicule you, and all that working on you, and that sometimes the person who comes in, the the naive inquirer who doesn't have those constraints is a fantastic role to be able to play to liberate things for people, even if there's no discernible output. So, yeah, I know what you mean, but it's...
I'm not in agreement with what I said. I'm kind of
No,
yeah,
but, you know, it's like really interesting because one person's vanity project might be somebody else's chance to get something else done.
Can I draw attention to the last question, which was the barriers to social design research becoming more persuasive and more visible, in a sense that we probably would all say, yes, design research has a capacity, whether it's academic research or in a consultancy model or supporting local council officers or voluntary organisation staff or volunteers. So it's a good thing, and yet Paul says just get on and do it. Adam's talked about the detailed and careful infrastructuring on different levels to build relationships and build opportunities and work in the spaces. So there's a sort of assumption in our here now that it's a good thing, and here in UAL we are probably quite good at doing it in different spaces, and yet there are these barriers. So any final thoughts on barriers and challenges for that final positive end?
Yeah, I mean, I guess me saying just got on and do it kind of reflects a little bit about my personality. I mean, I'm kind of massively impatient. I get, really kind of itchy and fidgety. And I understand that can also be a bad thing. But, so, I mean, being impatient for change, I guess kind of helps you a little bit. I think interestingly there's in recent years there's been a kind of massive movement, hasn't there, in service design and social design. And you could say it's quite a growing, emerging phenomena. So it's kind of interesting to use the word barriers then, because I think there's strong evidence that of service design, social design startups, particularly amongst kind of recent graduates that I know, who are kind of moving away from, I guess when I was a student of design, when you were kind of hoodwinked perhaps by the kind of global players and brands, and it was all about producing more stuff. And I think in recent years there's been a palpable change in the mindsets of young designers wanting to kind of engage with much more kind of social innovation projects. That's certainly my experience, where there certainly has been a sea change in kind of attitudes. So I think some of those, I kind of understand what you mean by barriers, but I think
I was thinking of it more in relation to, for example, investments in data science, vast infrastructures for technological investment, and particular kinds of digital data, digital evidence, digital participation, rather than running a workshop with some bits of paper, for example. So that kind of massive infrastructural investment in research capacity, as well as what people think of as going to get them some kind of new ideas or new solutions. So the sort of sociological, the imaginaries that are tied up with research, that there's those kind of barriers, rather than what brilliant young design students might do when they come out feeling passionate about changing the world.
Hello, so I'm Tom. I'm a designer, and I think I was just going to pick up on that because obviously I've worked quite a lot with data, and I think that the problem that I can see in most of the discussion we've had this evening is about mapping. So at the moment I'm running a project with the Dutch Ministry for Infrastructure, and it's about how you communicate these pieces of research to people, to publics, in that what they've noticed is, and I think someone else picked it up, is that a department will run a piece of research and a consultancy will come back to them with a similar issue or a similar solution. And so over a period of time, there is very little engagement with things that have come previously. And so by creating an ongoing map, I suppose, I don't think they're calling it a map, it's just a way of engaging with previous pieces of research and imaginaries, because they're plotting this on a sort of temporal space forwards. They're sort of saying there is a time scale to these sorts of things. The thing that they're really interested in doing is taking that and opening that up into a public platform so that people can engage with those, and they can start to use new tools to sort of try and try and find some sort of consensus amongst those different stakeholders that wouldn't necessarily be visible before. And I think that all of the discussions that we're having need to be sort of like bookended by the fact that there are new emergent digital tools that are really going to change the way that these sorts of ideas and the way that these sorts of structures are made visible and sort of understood by other people.
Absolutely, and that opens up challenges not just around digital literacy, which we've been talking about for a long time, but if we're going to start hanging things off of data, you know, who's data literate then? You know, and who's going to be involved in that conversation? Only the data literate? When we've already got, what, 35% of people that aren't digitally literate still? Or 25% of people that aren't digitally literate still?
I would go further backwards with that and ask the question, well, how do you get people to engage in the first place with these things? I made that kind of rather naughty aside to the EHRC co-production project, which I said there wasn't much co-production in it, because as far as I could see, with the 5 projects they ran, simultaneously with the projects we ran, was that they were run as pilots. In other words, that the thing they were producing and their assumption of the publics they were going to engage with was already made before they actually did the projects. Okay, so for example, one of them, okay, speaking anecdotally, potential people who, you know, of outside academia stakeholders who thought about getting engaged, couldn't see the point of it, you know, what was in it for him, because that hadn't been designed or thought about within the project itself. Okay, so you know, I think there's a massive amount of work to, you know, of rethinking how we engage. Right?
We are trying to do some of that work, and I do want to, even though we're going a lot about sort of models and stuff, it's not that we just sort of sit there and try and come up with these pictures. Obviously, we're action researchers. Yeah. So we go out there and we get on with it and we do it, but then we take a moment to reflect on what we've done and try and codify it and share it with others in ways that are accessible. Yeah. And hopefully accessible across discipline. So I just wanted to put that in there. We're not just sitting there drawing pictures. We're actually going out and doing stuff and then going back and drawing pictures as part of the process. Because I thought, you know, so we're doing similar stuff as well as the codifying of it. Yeah. But around that stuff, one of the tools that we've got is this actor wheel, which is what I was trying to talk about previously, which really does start to highlight who's involved at what stages of the project and to what extent. And then we were talking the other day about, have you come across Easy Riders? No. Not the film. It's a bit like FutureGov, but I think it's run by some an Italian organisation leading it. And it's a bit like FutureGov, but there are maybe 20, 30 international open collaborative projects that are going on there. And what they're trying to do is go from this sort of transnational perspective of digitally including people in the conversation. And what we're trying to understand is how that can get down to the local perspective. So I think it might be interesting. I found it interesting. I found out about it 2 days ago.
Yeah, there's something similar called Polis. I don't know if you've come up, which is like a deliberation platform which they've used at scale in Taiwan for sort of big binary decisions. I think it was about alcohol consumption after a period over a time, I think, or being able to buy alcohol after a period of time. And I think that what the Dutch government have realised is that with big decisions, you do get, I think there was like a threshold of about 100,000 people that were online deliberating this thing, and it was using machine learning to try and draw some sort of consensus from that. But when you do, it doesn't function when you only have 20 or 30 people engaging with an issue, and actually it is over. You can still glean those sorts of insights, but it just takes a lot longer. And so it's by opening up that discussion, leaving it open, and allowing people to engage with it at multiple stages throughout its cycle. And perhaps once it's finished, you're still able to add to that sort of discussion, I suppose, and that's what they're hoping to do. So it's kind of, I think it functions in a similar way.
But when we have binary decisions and we get millions and millions of people involved, look what happens.
Yeah, and I was
very
going
divisive.
to comment on that. That is also something which is part of social design. I mean, the incorporation of big data into society and how we understand it is one of the big questions about how do we design it in a way that is meaningful and helpful to people and they can use it themselves. We know that. And it's interesting because Ireland has done, I mean, Ireland tried to advise Britain apparently on how to run a referendum because it was doing so much with a kind of citizen jury model where actually people were primed to it, they understood it, they could use the tools, and of course Britain didn't take any notice, so be it. But you know, that sort of process, the one you're outlining too, there's this new knowledge for us, but it's a very important part of social design now because it's the opening of policy. If it is the opening of policy, who knows? Okay. We'll see what happens. I mean, there's a lot of pseudo-consultation gone on for many generations.
So I'd like to thank you for your questions and thoughts and comments and our speakers, Paul Rodgers, Anne Light, Adam Thorpe and Guy Julia. As we said, this will eventually make it online onto the Innovation Insights Hub webpage on the UAL website. Thank you. Join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.